Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Minda de Gansburg Center for European Studies. My name is Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm the director of the center and professor of government at Harvard. And this event is August Zaleski Memorial Lecture in Polish Modern History at Harvard University. This lecture was established in 1983 as a generous gift from the estate of August Zaleski widow, Ewelina Zaleski. The lecture is in honor of the 20th century Polish economist, diplomat, and politician who, among other positions of prestigious position, was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland before the Second World War and was also the president of Polish government in exile after the Second World War. In the last 50 years or so, Poland has produced three quite extraordinary surprises. And those surprises had really shock waves through Poland, through the region, and through Europe. So the first event and the first big surprise was the emergence of the Solidarity movement. This was one of the most innovative, one of the most massive movements in modern European history. And it was the nail to the coffin of the communist system in Eastern Europe. It was a great event, not only in Polish history, but also in European history, which is not as much appreciated today as it should be. The second event, or rather the chain of events, started in 1989 when Poland led the transformation, political and economic, in the region. Poland was the first country to negotiate a peaceful transition from the communist rule, hold the democratic elections, and had the first non-communist government in the region. This political transformation was followed by amazing economic and social transformation, which made Poland one of the fastest growing economies in the world in the last 20 years, and it quadrupled the income per capita in the span of 20 years. Poland, in this experience of transition, was probably ahead of many other or all other post-communist countries in Europe. Now, the final surprise I would like to mention goes back to the elections in 2015. During those elections, the president of the country, the presidency of the country, and the majority of the country's parliament was taken over by Law and Justice Party. One could say that the all power has been in hands of ultranationalistic and conservative party headed by Jarosław Kaczyński. Now, with surprising speed, Kaczyński and his party and his government unleashed illiberal counter-revolution in Poland, designed to give the peace and constrain political power and remake Polish democratic institutions and country's relations with the European Union. The first targets of peace government was the justice system, the Polish media and cultural institutions, and civil society. The purges of state-owned enterprises and Polish military followed very quickly. The most important conflict of that period focused on the Polish Constitutional Tribunal. The peace government decided to take over the tribunal, violating the Polish constitution and ignoring protests of all organizations outside Poland and inside Poland. And this is my great honor to welcome at Harvard a person who was at the center of that struggle to save Poland Constitutional Tribunal and protect the rule of law in Poland. Professor Andrzej Rzeplinski is the professor of Warsaw University, Faculty of Applied Social Sciences and Resocialization. He's a head of the Criminology and Criminal Policy Department as well as the Human Rights Studies Center at the University of Warsaw. He graduated from Warsaw University, holds the PhD from Polish Academy of Sciences. Professor Rzeplinski became the justice in the Polish Tribunal, Constitutional Tribunal in 2007, and from 2010 to 2016 was the president of that Constitutional Tribunal. His expertise is in constitutional law, in human rights, judicial system, criminology. He published extensively and taught at Warsaw University for many years. He cooperated with many international institutions and organizations, both in the US and Europe, and was the member of Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. He also was honored by numerous prizes and honorary degrees. Professor Rzeplinski's lecture today will be on dismantling democracy on the EU watch, Poland and its constitutional tribunal. After Professor Rzeplinski's lecture, we will have the opportunity to hear comments from two distinguished lawyers and academics. First, Scheppele, who is visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School this semester, but permanently she is the Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Woodrow Wilson School at the University of Princeton and at the Center for Human Values. Kim taught widely in many European and American universities, including the Central European University in Budapest, which we will have an opportunity to talk about in different occasions. Kim is an expert on the intersection of constitutional and international law, and she's studying particularly the countries under constitutional stress. The second commentator would be Noah Feldman, who is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and director of the Julis Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law. Professor Feldman is also the senior fellow of the Society of Fellows at Harvard, was constitutional advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. He has his PhD from Oxford University and degree from Harvard, published widely on a variety of issues connected to constitutional law. So this is my great pleasure. Please join me to welcome Professor Rzeplinski.
Professor Ekiert, it is, of course, you know how I will start. It's a great honor for me to be here. But on the other side, my position is really difficult. The counter-revolution in Poland is going on every day and every night when it is necessary. This is a revolution against the rule of law and constitutional democracy. 2 years ago, I could not imagine that I will be in such a difficult situation. Last November, I attended International Conference of Judges in Washington, D.C. And my colleague from Vietnam, who visited Constitutional Court in Poland 5 years ago to study our way to democracy and rule of law, she told me last September, you see, we lost Poland. We lost Poland as an example that there is a way to reach democracy, rule of law, respect for rights, and confidence of everyone with the state and the law adopted by the state organs. And we lost you as this, the best example. And also, it was opinion of my colleague, I met him in American Embassy in Warsaw many years ago, who said, you see, Andrzej, we are furious with you. We use Poland and your experiences in American programs for countries who are open for change, for transformation into rule of law. And we can not in a position to request you, to ask you, to take you with us, to work together. And there's so many jobs to do in the future. I have no time to say in details what should be interesting and what should be discussed. Probably many books will be published in the future, not only in Poland, about what had happened. I will start from a piece of legislation we are very proud of, as you Americans, of your Constitution. Your Constitution was a genius instrument to set up the country, its economy, institutions, and procedures, and also develop such institutions like the Supreme Court. We also have a quite old constitution, in fact the oldest one in Europe, adopted in May 1791. And this constitution was with us in a quite different way. It was a symbol of what we can do as Poles in Poland, including that Poland at the time was a multinational, big country. But unfortunately, we had stupid and crazy rulers who lost everything for Russia, Prussia, and Austria. But the Constitution was a real symbol, and it helped us to get again independence in 1918. In Article 7 of that Constitution, as we call it, May Constitution, we read, judicial power cannot be exercised either by the legislative authority or by the king, but by the magistrates at that end established and elected. It should be so attached to places so that every person close to each other finds justice, so that the transgressors can see everywhere the hand of the national government threatening. In the 19th century, three legal systems and different law cultures on Polish provinces, in fact, divided also jurists. And it was, I think, miracle that just during 20 years between two big wars, we were able to unify basic acts of the law, like civil law, criminal law, administrative law, and to set up institutions, and also to create a group of very good jurists, judges of the Supreme Court, the highest administrative tribunal, and also a group of excellent advocates, especially in Lvov or in Ukrainian Lviv. Most of our judges, prosecutors, and attorneys were killed in the war by Germans or by Russians. So still again we started from ground zero in 1945 with a system which was completely absent to Polish legal culture, the Soviet one. When the law and prosecutors and judges were member of the machine constructed to make people as servants of the state, as no citizen, and no citizen, but just those who should implement orders from the Communist Party. There's something mysterious with the judicial power, as I observed it, publishing about the history of judiciary under the communist system in Poland and in other countries in our region, that even if such difficult times, when a judge had to observe instructions from the Communist Party committees, many of them were able to serve as independent judges after 1989. I think that in Poland we were quite well prepared for transformation, including constitutional control of legal system in our country. It was already in 1981 when the Solidarność movement in its resolutions demanded to set up a separate and independent institution to control constitutionality of laws adopted by the parliament. Of course, it was not the most important reason that General Jaruzelski decided to amend the constitution, the communist constitution, to add a chapter on constitutional court and the tribunal of the state to punish those who violated constitution. The original reason was that he and his colleagues wanted to send to prison for years Lech Wałęsa, but Wałęsa was defended by our advocates, presenting arguments that as a chairman of Solidarność, he was not in a position to be accountable as a public officer. But finally, this chapter in the Constitution served to set up a Constitutional Tribunal already in 1985. And the first judgment was issued almost 31 years ago in May 1986. And although 6 of 12 judges were members of the Communist Party, none of the Constitutional Tribunal judgment did not compromise that court. Because when you read, many of those judgments are translated into English. The main idea of members of that court, all of them were professors of different disciplines of law, mostly from Warsaw, but not only. the main idea was to introduce into our legal system that the Constitution is the basic law, and any parliamentary act and any governmental order must be in accordance with the constitutional principles and values. So we, in fact, in comparison to other Central European countries, in the process of transformation, were ahead around 5 years. And of course, our success, and it was a great success of our court, was also thanks to our cooperation with our German colleagues, Austrian colleagues, then also French colleagues, and we paid what we got from them, assisting our colleagues in Romania, in Lithuania, and in last years also our colleagues and partners in Ukraine when they had problems. So it is also a reason that for me it is very difficult to say what had happened to us in that revolution. And this revolution is run, as I said, with no interruption, with no rest. It is like a shark who never sleeps. Even today, I learned that there are two really important information from Warsaw. The first one is a draft of the law on ordinary courts, in fact making from the directors of or presidents of all courts in Poland, from the district to courts of appeal, functionaries of state administration, subordinated absolutely to the Minister of Justice, who is also at the same time Prosecutor General. So that prosecutor, but also all prosecutors in Poland, there are 6,500 prosecutors in Poland, can manipulate proceedings in any case. Of course, in vast majority of cases, there is no need for the government from the ruling party to realize what is going in. But they are interested in some cases when, for example, a company run by my colleague would have a problem with other company in the court. So it is enough to call to the president of that court and to say, you know, we have such a problem, and our party colleague has legal problems with his business partner, and we think that he's in right position, and we expect that the judgment will be convenient for his firm. It is a real danger, knowing not only the present Prosecutor General, but also a group of prosecutors who, like wolves, would control judges. I observed it in Communist Poland. In Communist Poland, also majority of judges did their job independently because Communist Party was not interested in those cases. But in any case, which was important for the Communist Party, not only just from the ideological point of view, also from the personal point of view, communists also had problems with the families. They wanted to be divorced, and they wanted to buy private property and so on. And so from time to time, they use courts and judges as important institution to make the private interest or private situation respected by others, having in hand judgment of the local court. In a constitution adopted in 1997, still our constitution, although more or less I can say that decision was already taken that Poland would have a new constitution. Constitution would be based on ideas of Professor Carl Schmitt and others who believed that modern state, energetic state, should be constructed on different idea than constitutional democracy, free elections, democratic debate in the parliament on any legislation, and independent institutions to control legality of decisions of public administration, and also respect for dignity of any person despite his or her sex or nationality or origin and so on. In the constitution, which still we have, there's a separate chapter on Constitutional Tribunal. The tribunal, in fact, doesn't function, at least since 4 months, is completely paralyzed. But theoretically, that court, Constitutional Court, as courts in other European countries, in Poland, theoretically, more or less the same situation is in Hungary. Our court shall adjudicate on the conformity of statutes and international agreements to the Constitution, of statutes and to ratified international agreements whose ratification required prior consent granted by statute, of legal provisions issued by central state authorities to the Constitution, like Council of Ministers, Prime Minister, or ministers, or some other so-called central constitutional organs. The tribunal also shall adjudicate on the conformity to the Constitution of statute of or another normative act challenged in a constitutional complaint referred in the Constitution. It offers this provision offers to any, not only citizen, but also any person under Polish jurisdiction, right to complain against a provision which was based on a decision or judgment, with arguments that this provision is not constitutional. According to our Constitution, also ordinary courts can ask a question to the Constitutional Tribunal when they have doubts about constitutionality of a provision, which will be the legal based on for the judgment. The tribunal shall also adjudicate on the conformity to the Constitution of purposes or activities of political parties. It is a sensitive competence of the court. But in fact, in our history, there were only 2 cases submitted to that court, to our court, concerning constitutionality of, in one case, far-right group using fascist or Nazi symbols, and another one very populist leftist party since those both parties were registered with the court, and also they did not call for using violence in political debate. So our court decided in both those cases, similarly to a jurisprudence of other European courts, that it is better for the legal system, for the society, to keep them on the ground and not underground, as long as they refuse to use violence, and when they support, as long as they do not support violence, and as long as they accept to some extent legal system. Also quite sensitive competence of our tribunal is to settle disputes over powers between central constitutional state authorities. In fact, there was only one such a case, very important, not only for our jurisprudence, but also for our partners in other European countries. It was a case sent to us by the Prime Minister and today Chairman or President of the European Council, Mr. Donald Tusk. There was a dispute between him as a Prime Minister and late our President Lech Kaczynski in 2007. In fact, the constitutional problem, which is well known also to jurisprudence of the American Supreme Court, how many political, foreign politics can run just one country, one or two or maybe more. So it was dispute who does represent a Republic of Poland in the European Council and in NATO organization. So we decided upon that problem, and we said in our judgment that in Poland it is the Council of Ministers and Prime Minister who is in charge of foreign policy and internal policy. Although, according to some provisions of our constitution, the president is also important actor in foreign policy because he appoints our ambassadors. And he must be consulted also by the Prime Minister about the strategic politics with our partners. And the last one, probably the most sensitive, say that the tribunal shall determine whether or not there exists an impediment to the exercise of the office by the President of the Republic of Poland. If the tribunal so finds, it shall require the marshal of the same, this is name of our parliament, to temporarily perform the duties to the President of the Republic. And the situation on April 10th, 2010 was so dramatic and so quick that we as a tribunal have no chance to declare that at first that the president of our country probably died, and the Speaker of the House is temporarily chief of the state. But when there was already information from Minister of Foreign Affairs that in that catastrophe all passengers died, the Speaker of the House declared himself as a acting president of the Republic of Poland. So there's no role for us to decide in a procedure typical for a judicial institution. It was done beside us. What have happened in the last 15 months in our very dynamic history concerning rule of law and democracy, constitutional democracy? The first act, I think that there's an internal logic in that process, in the decision taken by a person who has a full power in his hands and no accountability, no constitutional accountability. So at first, what was important was to demolition of the civil service. Our civil service was based and developed on example of the French civil service. And already it was, after 27 years, a second generation of those who wanted to study governments and management and also political sciences and also practice in public institutions in Poland and in other countries to be fully professional officers of the civil service in Poland. And really they were very well prepared and independent from politicians, like in England or like in France. Of course, as in any part of the public administration, you can find also people ready to be corrupted or are not very efficient, so they should be changed. But there was a procedure how to do that. And all others were saved as long as they fulfilled their duties according to law. There's no anymore civil service in Poland. Everyone who is director of department, being under the vice minister in the ministry, cannot know exactly what did happen in the past. It's not important. What will happen with him or her is important. And it is, in fact, just a matter of the decision to fire even very good civil servant, because the place should be offered to someone from my family or family of my chief or any other who is important for the ruling party. The second was, and always, all the time, in the background, there was Constitutional Tribunal. Between November, exactly the first law was adopted on 19th November 2015, and the last one in December the 16th. Any that law, and altogether there were 8 parliamentary acts regulating situation, position, competences, and role of members of that, as I said already, very sensitive, very important, and crucial for the rule of law and constitutional democracy institution, the Constitutional Tribunal. So 8 acts, and every next one was worse, was more authoritarian, and was adopted in that way to prohibit to the Constitutional Court constitutionality of that act. The very last one had no even 1 day of vacatio legis, no 1 day, with one institution which was completely unknown to the Constitution, so-called acting president of the Constitutional Court. To avoid to be the president of that court when my term was finished, to pass this function to the deputy Chief Justice, and this institution, Deputy Chief Justice, is mentioned in the Constitution. But in that act, there was something new. Acting president of that court with no role of the members of the Constitutional Court. Just the day after, this person was appointed by our president, Dr. Duda, as this acting president, and the acting president next day sent to the president resolution of the General Assembly of that court, and there was no any General Assembly, in fact, that she was proposed by General Assembly as president of the court, and she is, and she paralyzed that court completely. The next aim was public media, and in last 2 months also private media as well, to subordinate public media not to the state, not to the prime minister, to the party, to the leader of the party. And under the slogan privatization, Polonization of private media, the ruling party and its chief want to have control over private newspapers and private TV channels. I think that in next couple of months, probably in case of newspapers, in next 3 months we will have a new law, more or less similar to that one adopted a week ago in Budapest, where this law subordinated and to the government all universities, including a private university set up by George Soros, a personal enemy for Prime Minister Orban. Next was to demolish freedom of peaceful assemblies. Now, just one provision was enough to subordinate that freedom to interests of one party. As long as those party interests would be in collision with the will of a group of citizens to organize public assembly, peaceful assembly, it could be prohibited, and with no explanation, with no right to send a case to the court. Next was what is really important and useful for any authoritarian state is the police and prosecutors. Of course, right now in Europe we have a very difficult situation with terroristic attacks. In Poland, there's no terroristic attacks. My personal opinion is that that the policy of government in Warsaw to be absolutely negative to accepting any asylum seekers under this policy of fighting against terrorism would not prevent us against terror, because terror is not just concentrated in those countries where there are citizens or inhabitants of Muslim origin. This propaganda on fighting and preventing terrorism was a background to change police law and offering to the police right to spy anyone without any possibility to have a kind, even very least judicial review of legality of such decisions. So nobody knows who is spied and why and for what. And nobody has a right to control the police, and not only secret police or security police, but also ordinary police. And the next were prosecutors. A law was adopted just in new Polish standards. It was quite a long procedure in the parliament, around 7 weeks. After 7 weeks, everything was changed. And there are no anymore prosecutors of the Republic. There are prosecutors of the party. If you want to be appointed as a prosecutor or promoted to the high level of that structure, you should know what are expectations of the prosecutor general, what are interests of the political party he represents. And they are a useful, very useful instruments to subordinate judges in Poland in the future. And even something what really nobody could imagine that it would be changed as a kind of keeping control not only on some groups in big cities and opposition parties, but also in the country. There's a law on strict control of agricultural land trade, and obviously it is against provisions of the European Union law. It was my very last case as a constitutional judge in Warsaw. I prepared a question, judicial question, to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. And the day after, I left the court. And of course, the decision was that there's no need to ask the court in Luxembourg on legality of that acting with and its compliance with the European law. And it was not just a matter of changing legislation. It was a matter of the political decisions to subordinate state-owned companies to the law and justice party interests. So, you know, then the logic is like that you can offer very good jobs to your colleagues, to your family members, and you can buy even law professors to offer them to be a member of advisory committee in big companies. with a quite good remuneration. And also you have in hands of one party a lot of to offer to those who would like to be corrupted, and they're open for corruption. And this is, I'm afraid, a real problem also for our economy. Our economy still works quite well. After Sweden, rise of our economy is the highest still in Europe. But when there are private interests and not just logic of economy decides on the crucial decision in companies, you can expect that we lost also foreign investment in Poland, and we observe already that what is really very danger for us. What is the Constitutional Court armless in this way to destroy it as an instrument to protect the rule of law and constitutional democracy? In that time, those already longer than 1 year, we got support, a real support in Poland and also outside. At first, it was a Committee of Defense of Democracy. The demonstration gathering from 2,000 to 50,000 people in streets, demanding respect for independence and separation of Constitutional Tribunal from other institutions, public institutions. Of course, what were not respected by the leaders of the ruling party, but at least they make this process of demolition slower. Then what was important, in Poland we have quite many law schools, and those faculties offered in the resolution support for the Constitutional Tribunal, including law schools in Polish too, the biggest and the best universities in Kraków and in Warsaw. Then what was important as well, it was resolutions of the court, assemblies of the Court of Appeals and district courts. For judges, it is quite difficult, to gather, to discuss, and to adopt a resolution, because more or less, rather more than less, such a resolution is a political one. It is not a judicial statement. It is political statement to defend the position and the role of the Constitutional Tribunal. Also taking into account that quite many times the position of the Constitutional Court in our judgments were not accepted fully by judges in Poland. Next, it was really important, and right now this is more important to have a Supreme Court as separate and independent than a Constitutional Tribunal, because more or less it was demolished completely. But all that time, Supreme Court offered to the Constitutional Tribunal in its resolutions, but also what was important, even more important, in its motions challenging subsequent unconstitutional acts delegating the tribunal. Without those also very difficult decision of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but there should be also internal agreement and acceptance from other members of the Supreme Court. In fact, for 89 members of the Supreme Court, almost all but one supported those resolutions and motions with arguments challenging unconstitutionality of those laws. Very important was also comments, public comments of former presidents of the Constitutional Court, and it was also not only a support of academia or jurists in Poland, but also from outside. At first it was Council of Europe, the Venice Commission. The Commission was requested to prepare opinion on some of the drafts of the regulating or demolishing the legal position of the Constitutional Tribunal. The Venice Commission prepared two substantial opinion after everyone was after visit of a group of experts of that commission. This is commission which is official name is Commission for Democracy through rule of law through democracy. There was also important support from the Secretary General of the Council of Europe. It is very important in Europe institution. Council of Europe unites 47 European states, 47 European nations. And it also plays some role in this game we have with our government to make those policies slower than they wanted. And another, not foreign, but also our Polish institution, European Commission and European Parliament offered us, and not just offered, it's not correct word, not us, because it is a part of also institutions important for Polish citizens and Polish state. So it was a European Commission, and especially a deputy chairman of the Commission, Franz Timmermans, a brilliant and very brave, not lawyer, but just a high rank officer and European politician from the Netherlands. It was, still it is a honor for me to cooperate with Timmermans in defending the rule of law in Poland, but also in other countries. In the past, I cooperated with the Venice Commission, not in Poland, but in former Soviet states, defending courts and promoting human rights. And a European Parliament, in its plenary sessions and in the work of the of committees of that Parliament, was really important. to send signals to our government that the values, the principles of the European Union, as we have it in the Lisbon Treaty adopted in 2009, should be observed in Poland the same way as in all other European countries. Any contacts with foreigners from the Council of Europe or from the European Union institutions was defined in official propaganda that I sent hate information against Poland, and I am a traitor who fight with democratically elected government and parliament. Also from outside we got support from presidents of constitutional courts in Europe. The first call I got was already in November 2015 from my friend, president of the Austrian Constitutional Court, who asked me a question, what is going on in Poland? It was just second week of the rule of new party. Because, he said, our president is afraid that there is something wrong with your country. And Poland is really a very important partner for us. The same was a call from the president of the German Federal Constitutional Court and from others. And my reaction for offer of assistance was that at first we should do this, what is our job, to defend the court and to make this revolution slower using our reserves. Because when we just be dependent completely on you, it would make us weaker, not stronger. Having this never sleeping shark going forward and forward. But knowing that those courts, presidents of those constitutional courts are with us and offering us at least symbolic support was important. Also, foreign and international media, journals and TV channels, as long as they can enter Poland with no problem, and as long as they can meet with anyone who wants to meet with them and to discuss and to give information and comments, and there are still there's no problem with that. The reaction of the government is that you are traitors, you are not good Poles. But of course, those people do not afraid that and don't care it. What was also important, finally, I would like to say that our jurists, especially advocates, assisted the Constitutional Tribunal during that year, and their resolution, also in the Congress of Association of Polish Advocates, was a very strong signal sent to, especially to the President of Poland, that jurists are not going to accept this counter-revolution, as they said. Right now, although Constitution says that there are 15 judges of that court, there are 18. and three of them, in fact, they are. It would be easier for you to understand the position of, for example, General Flynn, who lied to the Senate. Those three, they lied to the same. In the very short period, in the very short procedure of appointing them to the Constitutional Tribunal, it was just 3 hours at night. And after midnight, they were sworn by the president. And no one in the parliament was in a position to ask any question to them. And no one from outside, non-governmental organizations, for example. And right now, after 1 year, we know that they do not say what would be extremely important for any deputy to decide I'm for or I'm against this candidate. For example, when someone was an agent of Secret Service, it is not, of course, crime to be an agent of Secret Service, but it is, everybody knows that when you once an agent of Secret Service, you are for life dependent, and you are connected to that service. In that way that at least you know people and they know you and they control you. And could you imagine a member of the Constitutional Court who has someone behind him or her deciding from time to time, of course, not in any case, saying, you see, you have such and such case and we are interested to know who will be in charge of that case in your court. This is something no one can accept in Europe as well. So this very short procedure, when 3 additional judges were elected, it was the first example, the first case when the parliament violated constitution and changed constitution. Not just, it was not violation, it was amendment to the constitution without changing the constitution. It was really very dangerous for the rule of law in Poland. And it was in December 2015, just first time. But now we have many examples that the constitution was changed by ordinary legislation. And nobody cares because there's no constitutional tribunal. In the tribunal there are many cases, and the president of the court decided that the court would not react in any way, and she even is not in a position to start reviewing of these cases submitted to the Constitutional Tribunal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will ask Professor Feldman for the first comment.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very grateful for the talk. I want to apologize in advance that I may have to leave a few minutes before things are finished. It won't be a comment on what's being said. Let me begin by saying that I think it's pretty clear that we're now witnessing a global erosion of constitutional restraints by populist and, in many cases, popularly elected governments. And I would like to organize my very brief comments into 3 parts. One offers a hypothesis about that erosion, of which Poland is obviously a very concrete and immediate example. And then parts 2 and 3 will explore both the internal and the external explanations and possible responses to this phenomenon of erosion. So let me start with the hypothesis. And it's that these erosions are self-consciously designed by the political parties that are implementing them and the individuals who are implementing them to be erosions rather than steps along the road to complete destruction of democratic institutions. So again, the hypothesis is that there is an intentional strategy that is very different from, let's say, the Schmittian, to refer to Carl Schmitt, the Schmittian approach of fascists or communists in the 1920s and 30s, whose objective was to implement some decisionist structure which would avoid the problematics of parliamentarism altogether. Okay? The hypothesis is that in Turkey, in Hungary, in Poland, obviously all in different inflected ways, the populist governments are seeking partial erosion in accordance with their own perception of their interests and of their capacities. That is to say, they're taking seriously into account what they can get away with. Now, I know there's an instinctive reaction to say, that's wrong. Anyone who erodes our democracies must have the intent to destroy them altogether. Now, that's a rhetorically appealing tack to take, and I don't say that people who are politically motivated shouldn't take it, but we're in a university, so part of our job is to try to understand the phenomenon, and I think I would argue that even activists have something to gain from trying to evaluate the strategic incentives of the people doing the erosion, and if indeed it's the case that their erosion is not intended to be steps on the way to total destruction, that's an important thing that needs to be taken into account. Okay, now let me talk about the modes of response that are possible, and I'm going to divide them into domestic responses and international responses. In each case, I want to use the metaphor of the ecosystem and what you might call the constitutionalist ecosystem. Now, in democratic societies internally, the constitutionalist ecosystem is made up in the first instance by governmental institutions like a constitutional court or other governmental actors who are very much vulnerable to changes that are adopted through the mechanisms of law, because by definition, these governmental actors, if they're constitutionalists, like to obey the rule of law, and they tend to treat a law, even an unconstitutional law, as a ground for perhaps expressing disagreement, but not usually for taking steps that are clearly outside of their constituted legal authority. And that may not, practically speaking, always be enough. That can include, for example, judges of the Supreme Court and other judges who operate at the national level who might be willing to push the edges of their own capacity to interpret the Constitution in the absence of meaningful constitutional review by the Constitutional Court, but who probably aren't in the first instance about to go into the streets. Now, I should note parenthetically that in some places it doesn't work that way. I think of Pakistan, where the lawyers' movement was organized around a chief justice, a displaced chief justice, who became an actor in a sort of classic political movement style response to erosions of constitutional legitimacy. So I don't mean to say that that's never the case. I'm just pointing to a specific limitation. Beyond that, there are civil society institutions that make up the core of the ecosystem, and they range from lawyers and law professors all the way to, of course, in the Polish context, at one time, trade unions. We all know the range of civil society institutions and their capacity to respond, and of course in Poland, as indeed to some degree in other places, there have been very substantial civil society responses at an organized level, at a political level, to the governmental overreach. And it behooves us to ask why they haven't been more successful than they have been. I think that's very important, because they have existed, they have been organized. I myself have not been in Warsaw since May, but in May, there were plenty of street protests. There had been many street protests already in the past, and the movement that was organizing them was, as all of you know, seriously committed to going forward. And its members are, like civil society activists everywhere, brave, smart, and willing to take the consequences to a very great extent. So the classic question from a domestic constitutional perspective is to ask whether broad public support for the Constitution from the standpoint of political culture had simply not sunk in deeply enough in some of the countries that we're talking about for the ecosystem of civil society response to be strong enough to push back effectively at the government. Right? This is what James Madison would have called constitutional veneration. He said overtly already at the Constitutional Convention that the Constitution would have a much better chance of continuing if it got very old, that old age was a good thing. Of course, there were downsides to old age, but a certain degree of veneration, his term, and would be effective at pursuing, at facilitating obedience to the Constitution. Today, in a maybe more subtle way, we would call that political culture. I'm not sure how much more subtle that is, in fact, but we like to offer that sort of an account. And that political culture, of course, has to be at the public level, and it has to be connected to institutions. So obviously one thing to say is that where democratization is relatively new, it has less penetration into the depths of the political culture across the full political spectrum. This also, however, may be part of the reason that the erosion is not meant to be absolute. It may be, and I think it probably is, part of the judgment of the eroders that pushing too far with the reduction of constitutional norms would actually generate precisely the kind of civil society response that they wouldn't be able to respond to. So they may be simply more sophisticated in their judgment. The eroders may be more sophisticated in their judgment of how far they can push than the civil society opponents are. Right? They are in some sense saying we have this much public legitimacy, we'll experiment, this is obviously dynamic and experimental, we'll try to figure out how far we can go. We know there will be civil society protests against us, but if they get too far, we'll find ourselves in a position of beginning to back down. Now, if that's possibly true, if there is a dynamic game of analysis going on, it raises a really complicated and hard question, which I'll just put on the table. I don't think I can answer it here, and I'm not sure the data exists to answer it. But it's this: why aren't those eroders afraid of the consequences to them and their political parties if and when there's a rotation of power and they're out? I see a few people nodding. I bet a nickel that the people nodding are all professional political scientists, right? Political science has taught us, not that the field is univocal on this point, but one crucial element that every beginning student in political science studies is that one of the motivations for governments to observe constitutional norms is that if there is going to be a rotation of power, if there's some probability of a rotation of power, they want their rights to be protected when they're on the outside. One thing that strikes me is that, although in some instances, perhaps Turkey, the government may imagine that it'll never be displaced from power, any place where elections are continuing and where the elections themselves have not become completely corrupted, it's probably not the case that these governments think they'll never be out of power. My suggestion, I wouldn't even call it a hypothesis because I don't have enough behind it to call it a hypothesis, but my suggestion is maybe they just are confident in the relative weakness of the commitment of liberal democracy to punish them in any meaningful way if they're out of power. Maybe they're simply free riding on the observation that if they ever were to go out of power, liberal Democrats will say, well, we're going to put the Constitution back into place, so we're going to let you have free speech. We're going to let you remain free from arbitrary arrest. We're not going to do to you what you are preparing slowly to do to us, or are in fact doing to us. If that's true, that is a serious structural problem with the phenomenology of liberal democracy today in countries where democracy is weak. Okay? I mean, that really is a variant on the 1930s worry about a liberal democratic state that is not robust enough in defense of itself to facilitate the successful persistence of democracy in the face of threats. Okay, that's something I think we should all be watching and thinking seriously about it. Let me turn now finally and briefly to the international constitutionalist ecosystem of which we were just hearing, the Council of Europe, the European Commission, institutions which have been thought tentatively, but have been thought by many observers, especially of Europe, over the last quarter century, to be distinctive in offering a new set of incentives and mechanisms for the continuation of constitutional democracy. A lot of ink has been spilled by people with a lot of confidence that we had discovered, to some extent, a new technology for the maintenance of constitutional democracy. I wrote a little bit of that myself in the context of Turkey. Right, before the last 25 years, the standard view in constitutional literature was to say that it's really up to the internal function of the state to maintain its democratic and rule of law principles. And if it fails internally, it fails internally. No one really thought in the literature, I don't think, that external forces would be a stabilizing or substantially I hate that word, a substantially incentivizing factor for eroding democracies within. But we have developed the view, we collectively, academics have developed the view that these institutions are actually supposed to be better than that. And sure enough, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're producing reports, they're issuing guidance, they're issuing decisions. We recognize the challenges to that, especially veto-related challenges. But they seem to be doing the things they're supposed to be doing. And I think it's a little soon to overstate, I don't want to overstate the case, But so far, despite following the scripts that they're meant to follow, in the same way that the domestic constitutionalist ecosystem is following its scripts, it isn't working, or it isn't working sufficiently quickly to alleviate the very serious concerns that we've heard of, which in my view are entirely justified, and perhaps may even be, for reasons of diplomacy, slightly understated. Okay, so I think we need to ask ourselves, first of all, whether the stories that we've been telling ourselves about the efficacy and the incentives are strong enough. That's one possibility, that in fact maybe the incentives for international participation were not as strong as they once were. Or, and I think that's probably not right, or, and here comes the kind of final punchline, or maybe, again, the credibility of the threat from those institutions to punish states that are eroding in their democratic norms is much less than we believed it to be. Okay? Here the idea is not simply that the liberal constitutionalism domestically would fail to punish those who erode the democracy once they're out of power. This is the view that the international organizations, specifically the European organizations, are insufficiently prepared to, and I don't just mean they're not projecting their capacity, but in a real dynamic, game, are in fact insufficiently prepared to punish states that are eroding democratic norms. And if that's right, we also need to think seriously about rethinking the institutional capacities of those international entities. Now, of course, at the moment when they seem weakest is the worst possible time to say, gee, we're blaming you for not being stronger. I get that. But that's also an iterative game that leads to a bad result. Because if we don't criticize these institutions and call for them to become stronger when they're at their weakest, they will lose entirely their capacity to act. So I'm not trying to be alarmist at all. What I'm trying to do is try to uncover some of the structural causes that we might be seeing. And I'll just conclude by saying that we shouldn't be entirely pessimistic. I remember when Iftikhar Chowdhury came to Harvard Law School when then Dean Elena Kagan, now Justice of the US Supreme Court, invented the medal of the Harvard Law School for him. We had never had such a medal before, and she made it up that day to award it to him. And when she introduced him, she called him the former president, the former Chief Justice, and he was very angry, and he interrupted her, and he said, no, I am the Chief Justice. I'm just not in my office at the moment. There are surprises where civil society institutions and international actors do better than they look like they're doing in a given moment. And I don't want to rule out such surprises. In fact, I want to hope for them. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm very honored to be here with President Rzeplinski, who's really been a hero through this crisis. And those of us who have followed every decision of the Constitutional Court know how hard it must have been to make those decisions under the kinds of pressures that he operated. There was at the beginning, I think Grzegorz actually said that, Poland has been the first in many regards, the first to have a constitution in Europe, the first to have the Solidarity movement, the first to actually call for the round table, the first to actually have free elections. But it's the second, or perhaps the third, to go through this particular sequence of events now in Europe. Hungary went first, starting in 2010, depending on how you think about Romania in 2012, which had a hiccup and now seems to be somewhat doing better. Poland is now going down this road that actually looks extremely familiar from these other cases and some of the cases that Noah mentioned as well. By now it actually even begins to look like these new autocrats have a playbook, and it's that you win an election fair and square the first time, big. Then what you do, if you can, you change the Constitution. Or failing that, you change the Constitutional Court. Or sometimes you try both. But the trick is to remove the constitutional obstacles to what's about to happen next, which is the concentration of power in the hands of one political party. And I do think in the case of Hungary and Poland that in fact these governments don't imagine that power is going to rotate. And here's the interesting thing about these new autocrats, which is that they want to appear to be constitutional democratic countries, which is to say they will not give up elections, they'll just rig them, The Hungarians have already done that with the 2014 election. Russia got there first, I might say. But, all these countries now have these incredibly sophisticated technologies for how it is that you can make an election look like a real election and yet produce a rigged outcome. And actually, Poland is just about to start a revision of its electoral laws. So there is this technology where you take over the Constitutional Court, then you go after the ordinary courts. The civil service is generally a target as well. The media have to be muzzled, or at least the broadcast media. This was actually a great Russian invention. People don't read papers except for folks like us who mostly don't count in big enough numbers to sway elections. So if you control the TV, that's enough. Then you can claim there's a free media with the print media. So we see this kind of thing happening in country after country after country. And frankly, there's not been a country that's gotten this far down this path that's pulled out of it through any way other than a financial disaster. See Russia, see now Venezuela, which actually started down this road a little bit earlier. So I do think we're seeing actually a kind of global phenomenon. I tend to think it's a lot more permanent than Noah might say it is, but I want to focus on a piece of the title for this lecture, which is sort of on the EU's watch, and to come to some themes that I think will, sort of complement also Noah's comments on this, which is that where's the EU been in all of this, right? So I lived in Hungary through much of the 90s, actually spent a lot of time in Poland because when the Constitution was being written, in all of these meetings they would invite in foreigners to keep the Poles from killing each other during these kind of negotiations over the new Constitution, which finally emerged in 1997. But during that time, the ambition of every country in the region was to join the EU as quickly as possible. And part of that was because it would then mean the country was a normal country. And part of it was that I think every country in the region, almost every party in the region, thought that joining the EU would be a kind of guarantee that the kinds of things happening now would never happen again. Now, everyone's wondering, so where's the EU? And here's where I want to say, it turns out this crisis, which is called now in EU circles the rule of law crisis, has almost the same dynamic as the Euro crisis and the refugee crisis, because it turns out that the way the EU operates is it half builds things and doesn't actually have the tools to fix things when crises happen. So the problem with the crisis that we're seeing now, the rule of law crisis, is that it was imagined, I think everybody believed the sort of end of history line, that once a country got to be a constitutional democracy, once it passed the test to get into a club like the EU, it would never go backwards. There was, in fact, the definition of a consolidated democracy, which is what you had to prove to get in the door, was that a constitutional democracy was, quote, the only game in town. There was no ideological competitor for some other form of government. And so when the EU decided to greatly expand in 2004 to include Poland and Hungary, and there were 10 countries that came in at the same time, there was a thought that once they got checked at the door, you wouldn't have to go on checking them. So the EU actually has no mechanism for continuing to review the democratic, constitutional, or legal health of any of its members. And so when Hungary started first down this path, you could see that the European Commission didn't actually know what they were looking at. They thought it would be temporary. They thought it would be something that would be corrected by democratic processes. They imagined that if they just issued a few warning statements, that actually eventually these countries would turn around. But it's the logic of these kinds of autocracies that what they try to do is to kill off the possibility of the rotation of power, while appearing to have the superficial institutions and procedures of a constitutional democratic state. So I agree, for example, that these new autocrats want to erode constitutional norms without killing them, or at least they don't want to appear to kill them. They want to have them appear to still be there so that people assume these governments can come back, but in fact they can't really. So what's the problem with the EU? Well, the EU never developed any mechanism for checking countries. So there really is no way to say in the EU, absent some special procedure, that a country has gotten massively worse. Worse still, even if you could demonstrate that a country would not now be admitted if it were in the shape it was in now at the time that the decision was made, there is no way to throw a country out. just not in the treaties. There is absolutely no possibility to do this. So what are the disciplining mechanisms that the EU has? Well, the EU built into the treaties a mechanism, it's called Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union, and what it imagines is that there will be a possibility of warning a state that it's about to enter a breach, that's about to breach EU values. That process requires 3/4 of the member states and 2/3 of the parliament just to issue the warning. There have not been 3/4 of there hasn't even been one member state that has actually called for disciplining either Hungary or Romania when it went through this crisis, or now Poland. The other member states are simply not standing up to the challenge. And in the European Parliament, we've been able to get majorities for resolutions that say we're worried, we think there's some problem with Hungary, with Poland. Never gotten to 2/3, because the party system at the European level will protect the countries that are backsliding. Their compatriots in their party family will ensure that these resolutions don't go through. So that's the first part of Article 7. There is, as you go through to actual sanctions, even assuming you can get over that first hurdle, the second step, which would actually be preparatory to issuing any sanctions, requires a unanimous vote of the member states minus the offending country. And this is where I wanted to say that this is really where it's really unfortunate that Poland, well, fortunate for the government of Poland that it came second. Because as soon as Poland was the second country to enter this, state of non-compliance with EU values, Viktor Orban stood up and said, I will veto any sanctions against Poland, and we know that Poland will veto any sanctions against Hungary. And the logic of the sanctions mechanism is that at worst you have this thing one at a time, because there is no way to discipline two countries at once, even if all the other countries agree. So the fact is that basically the EU doesn't have the tools to deal with this. They didn't actually imagine that this was going to be a problem. And in many ways, this is just like what we're seeing with the euro crisis, where any economist might have been able to tell them that if you have a common monetary policy, it would help to have some banking system and also a fiscal policy to go with it. And now we're seeing that if you don't have that package, then you can't actually have the monetary system work very well. We're seeing with the Schengen system and the refugee crisis that if you're going to have open borders, but you don't actually have a common immigration policy, that this is actually going to lead to a kind of tension and a crisis down the road. And in some sense, what's happening now with Hungary and Poland evinces the same kind of flawed logic of the way the European Union has grown over the years, where they thought, we'll check people at the door, check the countries at the door when they come in, and then, we'll allow them to quit, see Brexit. We'll have a disciplining mechanism which will come with a warning sign and everything else, and it will be so obvious all the other countries will agree. But in fact, that actually isn't what happened. So what we're seeing now in the European Union is that all of these crises are hitting simultaneously, and I think it's occurred to people that the way the European Union was built up, overpromised and has been able to, is sort of under-delivering. It can't actually do what many people thought it would do. But I want to end on an optimistic note. I always say I'm the optimistic American in the room, and so I want to try to say that there may be something good to say about all of this. And that is what I see in Hungary and what I see in Poland is not a lack of commitment to democracy or to the rule of law. Rather the reverse. The reason why people aren't having revolutions in the streets is because of the way the new autocrats function. They win elections, and they can say they won elections. And those who disagree with them actually say, well, but there was an election, so who am I to say? Which is a belief in democracy rather than its opposite, right? And ditto with the rule of law. The way that both Hungary and Poland have actually attacked the constitutional bases of their own system has been through law, has been through passing laws, awful laws, okay, but laws. And then people say, well, I'm not a lawyer, but they pass laws. And especially once the Constitutional Court is captured and it approves these laws, people say, but it's legal, who am I to say? Which is a commitment to the rule of law, not its opposite, right? So in other words, what's actually holding back civil society opposition is commitment to democracy and the rule of law, not its opposite. Which is why it seems to me what we need in both places is some way to say, well, what's good law and bad law, good elections, bad elections? We need some more robust sense of both what the rule of law and what democracy bring us. And this is also something the European Union is going to need going forward as well, because I think what's been moving about the European project is that despite its many flaws, despite the euro crisis, despite the refugee crisis, despite everything the EU has been through, most of the states aren't quitting. Many of them are digging in for the long haul and making future commitments, which is to say that at some level, even though everything looks like it's broken, what you see is actually a commitment to the underlying projects that were supposed to be the reason for all these institutions existing in the first place. That commitment, I think, is strengthening. So the trick is how to leverage in Hungary and in Poland the commitments to democracy and constitutionalism and rule of law that have prevented people from going to the streets as much as they might have. We need some critique, and in particular, we need alternatives. And this is where I want to say, I think, I work on Hungary, I've lived in Hungary, but I want to say Poland is way ahead of Hungary in this regard. So what do you need? Well, you need some ingredients that Poland actually has, and I'm going to end on this note. You need actually opposition political parties that you wouldn't mind actually governing the country. And Poland still has those. Actually, it may have rather too many of them because they divided the vote in the last election, but still, there are still existing parties. There are active citizens who will go to the streets when there is a major challenge, as I think we saw with the pictures of President Rzeplinski with the thank you signs, under his name. And you see a free media, so the broadcast media may be gone, but the print media are still there. In Hungary, there's very little left of any of this. And actually, one of Poland's great resources, and something I hope will be one of Hungary's great resources too, is the fact that this session started with a recitation of how good Poland's constitutional history is. The May 3rd Constitution still remains a major touchstone of everybody's sense of what Poland stands for. And ultimately, what we're looking for is actually a future that will live up to our best sense of history. Thank you.
Okay, let me briefly tell you what's going to happen. We are unfortunately running behind in quite serious way, so I will take the prerogative of the chair and extend a little bit, the time of this panel. Well, we can discuss. Then after the panel concludes, there is going to be an opening of a photography exhibit on Poland next door, and then reception in honor of our speaker upstairs. And the way we are going to do it now, I will ask for questions from the floor. If you could say your name and briefly ask the question, and then we collect the questions and ask Professor Rzeplinski later on to respond to some or all, depending on how many we have. So, are there any questions on the floor? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm a student. Hello. I'm a student of international relations. I'm getting my master's. And my question is on the terms of cyber attacks and in terms of like Russians hacking European elections, particularly in France. What type of tools the European Union has to protect itself?
My name is Javier Tucker. To what extent do you think that the symptoms that we see today are not perhaps something as new as just a continuity of the old system? Because if Jaruzelski and his minions were not punished, why should Kaczynski and his people be punished? They are not as bad as Jaruzelski was. And secondly, if the communists were careful to preserve a Potemkin village of legality, they also had a constitution and laws and judges and courts, and it all seemed to people who wanted to believe in it proper as a tool of propaganda. Again, why should not be continued and just have a new party instead of the Communist Party, and then have communism light?
Great.
If you have a question, please.
Hello, my name is Max Bigark. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I would just like to suggest an alternative framing for what has been said. So generally, we think of outcome as being necessarily separate from process. That's what makes the legal process legitimate. But perhaps the problem with Poland and Hungary is that they've succeeded in making the process completely separate from the underlying principles. So they succeeded in making the process completely separate from liberal democratic norms that underlie them. And I was wondering, to what extent is that reversible, even by a government that comes into power if the autocrats are voted out? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Alexandra Sojka, I'm a visiting scholar here at CS, and I'm originally Polish. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Rzeplinski for everything, not only for this talk, but for all his work in trying to protect democracy in Poland. And I have a very simple question that's probably a very difficult one as well. Because I talked to a lot of my colleagues back in Poland before this talk, and everybody was saying, okay, can you ask, what can we do? So I would ask this question to Professor Rzeplinski, what can actually people do in Poland, what the citizens can do right now to reverse what's going on?
Okay, could you pass the mic to Professor?
Karl Kaiser. To what extent does the debate that is taking place in the European Union, the critical debate, how does it affect the internal debate in Poland? What are the mechanisms and what's the impact? And in that connection, how does the threat perception of Russia, which is very pronounced in the Poland of today, and the necessity to rely on the West, the European Union and NATO, to what extent does that interact with this notion that on the one hand we need the West, on the other hand we have our own way? How does that play out in the internal debate?
We'll have the opportunity to continue the conversation upstairs. So let me now turn to Professor Rzeplinski for your response to some of those questions, because they were very complex and moving in various directions. So if you could choose and pick some, maybe.
I think that those who have power and the system they created, not just during 1 year or 2 years, like in Russia. They are not dictators. They are also dependent on a group of people surrounding them. And Russia, of course, is a quite different case to study. Many Russians could be safe as long as they are not interested in politics, and as long as they try not to rock the national economy in the way that the leader would not accept it. I don't think that Putin or Lukashenko in Belarus, they afraid very much that they will be punished. Punishment for them, I think, means that they know that every year they are older, and this is the problem of Kaczynski in Poland. He is already 67. And probably he is more radical even than Putin was. When Putin got the power, he was 42, as I remember. So before him, was at least one generation to construct the system he wanted to have, to fight with oligarchs on others, on one side, and also as it was in Poland right now, or in Hungary, The first aim of that reform was Constitutional Court in Russia. He dismissed some members of that court, and he changed the law, and he offered some not direct briberies. Putin moved the Constitutional Court of Russia from Moscow to St. Petersburg. The reason was that in 2003, St. Petersburg celebrated 300 years of its existence. But the idea was that not only the Constitutional Court, but also the Supreme Court, and also the main economic court will be also moved from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Putin was born in that city, and he likes much more Petersburg than Moscow, and everybody knows that in Russia. But the opposition from the Supreme Court members and from the main economic court members was so strong that finally only the Constitutional Court was moved from Moscow to Petersburg. But according to Russian regulations, constitutional judge has a right to have a villa offered to the member of that court, and also a car and so on, and they are paid pretty well. But every judge who was more or less forced to leave Moscow for Petersburg, they got also another villa in Petersburg. And so from the perspective of a judge who is, I don't know, 60 or 70 years old, it is something he or she can accept, and to offer it then to the children. So in that way, very simple way, Putin was in a position to keep control over the court, and he still accepts Professor Zorkin, a brilliant Russian jurist, but also on the other side, technically he is brilliant, but from the point of view of rule of law, democracy, and nationalism, Zorkin, whom I know personally, to say gangster, it would be, of course, too much. But a person who is ready to offer to Putin and to the system everything, any explanation and any judgment. In case of Crimea, the Russian Constitutional Court debated just 2 hours on the verdict, that this annexation was in accordance with Russian constitution and also with international regulations, especially the UN regulations. Of course, Zorkin knew quite well that that decision violated Resolution 2627 of the General Assembly. In Poland, the first Kaczynski is too old to have, the perspective of next quarter of century. So he wants to do everything much quicker. And of course, he has in his disposition mountains of money to offer to those who want to go together with him. And of course, there are different traditions to some extent between Poland and Russia. So what Putin could afraid for him, it is right now that he could be really punished and sent to prison, but not Kaczynski in Poland. Nobody, although some opposition politicians used to say that he must be punished for what he did to Poland in last 2 years. But I don't believe that it could happen. When Jaruzelski was not sentenced, why Kaczynski? So what Kaczynski is afraid of is just that he would lose the power. Political power, for him is everything. I have here a funny picture from the celebration of 7th anniversary of the catastrophe in Smolensk. And there was, like in the Red Square, composition of leaders. The place the leader stays and his colleagues means how far from the leader is comrade, Kowaliow or something like that. The same was in Warsaw a couple of days before. In Warsaw, Prime Minister was behind someone who is not as close to the leader as the Prime Minister is. And she used his famous finger to, he pointed out her and he said, "Come here to me, because you are closer to me in our hierarchy of personalities." And those who should accept this decision were not very happy. You can observe it in that very short film. So this is important for him. For him, power, political power, is everything. He has no family. He even was not a very successful in academia because, yes, he is doctor of law, but his doctorate is not a good piece of job. It was accepted as many other doctorates in any other country. Unhappy person, happy with the power. So when he would lose the power, he would lose everything. So I afraid that in his mind, the most important, even more important than to have a new constitution, is how to win next elections. And I agree with Professor Scheppele that this is really important. But how to do it in Poland, where still there's a quite strong opposition, divided, yes, but any opposition is divided. And opposition, political opposition in Poland is much stronger than in Hungary. And the reason, in my mind, that Orban was able to win twice, and probably he also will win next time, was that the former government, in fact, destroyed the national economy. There was corruption, and people were, set up with that system of pandemic corruption, interdependencies, and cynicism of the former government. In Poland, of course, the situation was completely different. We were really shocked that a country which was developing in that way can offer the power to someone who wants to change everything, whose idea was to separate Poland from the European Union, because union means all these pathologies, social, religious, and so on, and Poland should preserve its national and religion identity. And right now, I think that for him it is, after more than 1 year, the most important question is how to win next election. And with strong opposition, there is no way, to print results of the elections and not to count any votes and to have the final result. And what we can do in Poland, I think that what Europeans have to do in Poland, but also what Europeans have to do with Russian invasion in Ukraine, what Europeans have to do with the problem of Maghreb region, what Europeans have to do also with Turkey, going to the very, very strange and very dangerous regime, and what we Europeans can do with Europe after divorce with Britain. It is a problem for Europe that every parliamentary elections right now in Italy, in Germany, in France means that it is a crucial decision for the Europe, for the people of European countries. Every elections are crucial for the future of Europe. This is a real problem. And this is also a hope for Kaczynski in his game with European institutions. He used to argue they are not going to punish us. They are not, of course, going to propose to separate Poland from taking decisions within European Union institutions, because we are important for them. They need us. They need us as a quite big country. This is the sixth biggest country in Europe with quite big population. And Poland, as a big country, separates Europe from Russia. It is the reason that Germans are very careful in relations with Poland. The German ambassador said to me after a quite long conversation, he said in the end, you know, we Germans must be very soft with Poles. I said, this is very colonial approach. When you offer us softer treatment, so it means that we are younger brothers. And we, as younger brothers, can more with you, and you would accept it. This is what I would not like to accept, that because of the history, because what we, our experiences with Germans, at first it is not true, relations between Poles and Germans for 800 years, very peaceful. And it was a case of what they did to us and to Polish Jews in last century. But we should be equal in our relations. Otherwise, you just treat Poland as a huge territory separating Germany from Russia. This is good for you. It was also a reason that United Kingdom supported Polish motion to be a member of the European Union, because also for Britons to have this huge territory separating Europe from Russia was important. But it is not strategic position of Poles to be just a kind of sanitarian territory separating undemocratic Russia from democratic European Union. From my point of view, this is a real danger for Poland, because in fact nobody cares so much believing that Poles again will change the government, and in next couple of years again Poland will be a member of our family of Western European countries. But after last elections, I am not so confident with my compatriots. I think that there's something wrong with us, that that we are ready. We dare to commit almost suicide, to forget everything what we done in last 27 years, and we can offer a power to even to a person who was behind the list of candidates for the prime minister, for the minister of defense, or minister of interior, and so on. Nobody knows the composition of the future government, and people voted for them. So this is the problem, that Europe, in fact, is in a very, very specific process, not situation, but process. When results of election in Italy are critically important for Europe, but then there are more important and crucial elections in Germany, then at the same time in France. So what is Poland? Poland is, yes, it is important as that territory separating us from much more danger and much bigger and much more aggressive and imperialistic Russia.
You know, ending on this note is probably not the most pleasant part of the conversation, but I think that maybe we can continue over the glass of wine and come up with some more optimistic views about the future of Poland and the European Union. Let me please join me to thank Professor Rzeplinski. It was a great honor and privilege to have you here at Harvard at the Center for European Studies. And thank you, Professor Scheppele, for joining us for the discussion.